Now bring the camera in close, onto the man in the middle seat. Anil Menon was born in Minneapolis in 1976, the son of parents who had each crossed an ocean to build a life in America. His father from India, his mother from Ukraine. He grew up in a household stitched together from two very different worlds, and that instinct for finding the through line between systems that do not obviously belong together would end up defining his entire career. At Harvard, he studied neurobiology and worked on Huntington's disease research, the kind of unglamorous laboratory work that rarely makes headlines, but slowly builds the foundation for future breakthroughs. Then he did something that most future astronauts do not do. Instead of racing toward the sky, he went to India for a year as a Rotary scholar, working on polio vaccination campaigns, walking through villages, administering drops to children whose parents had never had the chance to protect them from a disease that had already been eliminated in most of the world. It was public health at its most direct and unglamorous, and it planted something in him that would resurface again and again over the following 2 decades. A conviction that medicine's highest purpose is protecting people in the moments they are most vulnerable. At Stanford, he pursued something unusual, a combined path through medicine and mechanical engineering, coding soft tissue simulation models at NASA's Ames Research Center while training to become an emergency physician. He became a flight surgeon in the California Air National Guard, then transferred toward supporting fighter operations, eventually logging over 100 sorties aboard F-15s and helping transport more than 100 critically wounded patients as part of a critical care air transport team. And in the civilian world, he ran toward disasters most people run away from. He was a first responder after the catastrophic 2010 earthquake in Haiti, one of the deadliest natural disasters of the 21st century. He answered the call again after the devastating 2015 earthquake in Nepal. He treated victims of the horrifying 2011 Reno air race crash, when a modified P-51 Mustang lost control during a high-speed pylon race and plowed into a crowd of spectators, killing 11 people in an instant. Somewhere along the way, this made him one of the most quietly battle-tested trauma physicians in the country. A man who had already stood in the middle of chaos and stayed calm long before he ever put on a spacesuit. In 2014, NASA brought him on as a flight surgeon, and here is where the story quietly starts intersecting with a name you almost certainly already know. Menon spent years as part of the medical team supporting long-duration crews on the International Space Station, learning the station's rhythms, its failure modes, its stresses on the human body from the ground up. Then, in 2018, a private rocket company with audacious ambitions and almost no experience putting humans into orbit came calling, and Menon became its very first flight surgeon. That company was SpaceX. At the time, SpaceX had never launched a human being anywhere. It had built an extraordinary rocket program on the back of satellite launches and cargo, runs to the space station, but it had never once had to answer the question that had haunted every human spaceflight program since Gagarin's first orbit: what happens to a person's body and a person's life if something goes wrong. Menon built that program from nothing. He wrote the medical protocols. He built the emergency response plans. He helped design what would eventually become the medical backbone for the historic Demo 2 mission in May of 2020. The flight that, for the first time in nearly a decade, launched American astronauts to orbit from American soil, aboard an American-built commercial spacecraft, ending a long an uncomfortable stretch in which the United States had been forced to buy seats on Russian rockets just to reach a space station it had helped build. Menon was the lead flight surgeon for 5 of those early crewed SpaceX launches. He helped build the company's research program and its nascent private astronaut initiatives. He even contributed to early work on Starship, the towering, still experimental vehicle that Elon Musk has repeatedly framed as humanity's ride to Mars. And through all of it, Menon kept practicing emergency medicine in actual trauma centers back on Earth, refusing to let his hands go soft, refusing to become a manager who had forgotten what it felt like to hold a dying patient's life in his fingers. By the time NASA selected him for its 2021 astronaut candidate class, he had already helped certify the medical safety of a generation of spaceflight without ever having flown himself. Here is where the story takes its first real turn, the kind of twist that documentary editors dream about, because the most interesting detail about Anil Menon is not actually about Anil Menon at all. It is about who he married. In 2016, Menon married a woman named Anna, a mission director and engineer who would go on to become one of the most recognizable names in the new era of private spaceflight. In September 2024, while her husband was still deep in astronaut candidate training, waiting for his own first flight assignment, Anna flew to orbit aboard SpaceX's Polaris Dawn mission, becoming part of the crew that conducted the first commercial spacewalk in history, and reaching the highest altitude any human being had traveled since the Apollo program. To his entire adult life making sure other people came back safely, his wife included, in a sense, since the medical protocols he helped design at SpaceX were part of the very system that carried her into orbit and returned her home. And now, finally, it was his turn to be the one on the inside of the capsule, not the one monitoring the data feed from the ground. That turn arrived in the form of a seat on a Russian spacecraft. And this is where the story widens out into something bigger than any one person's biography. Soyuz MS-29 is scheduled to lift off from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan on the same launch pad, Site 31-6, that has sent generations of cosmonauts and astronauts into orbit. Menon will fly alongside two Roscosmos cosmonauts, Pyotr Dubrov, who previously spent nearly a year aboard the station between 2021 and 2022, and Anna Kikina, the only woman currently active in Russia's cosmonaut corps, who made history in 2022 as the first Russian ever to fly aboard an American commercial spacecraft, and the first cosmonaut of any kind to fly on a U.S. vehicle since the final space shuttle-era Soyuz swap in 2002. Together, the three of them carry the call sign Tigris, and together they will lift off at 10:47 in the morning Eastern Time, riding a Soyuz 2.1A rocket into a trajectory that, remarkably, will bring them to the space station in just 3 hours and 2 orbits. A far cry from the 2-day rendezvous. Profiles that defined Soyuz missions for most of the 21st century. Docking is planned for the Preachel module at just before 2 in the afternoon Eastern Time, and once the hatches open, Menon, Dubrov, and Kikina will join an already crowded multinational crew aboard the station, NASA astronauts, a European Space Agency astronaut, and Roscosmos cosmonauts already in residence, forming one of the largest and most diverse crews the station has hosted in years. This is Menon's first spaceflight. It will also be one of the longest, an expedition expected to last. Now here's the reversal, the part of this story that should genuinely stop you in your tracks. Ask yourself, why is an American astronaut, employed by a nation that built its own multi-billion-dollar commercial crew program specifically to stop depending on Russian rockets, still strapping into a Soyuz capsule in the middle of a decade, defined by geopolitical tension between Washington and Moscow? The answer is not sentimentality. It is redundancy, and redundancy in human spaceflight is not a luxury. It is survival. Since 2022, NASA and Roscosmos have maintained what is often called a seat swap agreement, quietly continuing to trade seats between American commercial capsules and Russian Soyuz vehicles, even as the broader relationship between the two countries has grown colder in almost every other domain you can imagine. The logic is coldly practical. If a fleet of American spacecraft were ever grounded by a technical problem, exactly the kind of failure that has happened before, exactly the kind of failure that has kept entire vehicle types parked on the runway for months at a time pending investigation, the station cannot afford to have every American astronaut suddenly stranded without a ride home, and vice versa for the Russians. By keeping at least one American aboard a Soyuz and at least one Russian aboard an American vehicle at almost all times, both space agencies guarantee that the station is never left without a way to evacuate its full crew, no matter which country's rocket fleet might be sidelined on any given week. It is, in effect, an insurance policy written in human bodies, a hedge against catastrophe, quietly negotiated and quietly honored, even while the nations behind it argue, sanction each other, and in some domains barely speak. And there is a second, quieter reason this mission matters, one buried beneath the diplomacy. The very spacecraft carrying Menon into orbit is itself a machine on borrowed time. Russia's planned successor to the Soyuz, a next-generation vehicle called Orel, meant to eventually replace this 6-decade-old design, has been described by its own manufacturer as facing a critical development crisis, hampered by Western sanctions that have cut off access to components its avionics depend on, which means that for the foreseeable future, this aging, endlessly reliable, occasionally terrifying spacecraft, first designed in the depths of the Cold War space race, remains not a relic, but a lifeline, still the only human-rated Russian vehicle capable of reaching orbit, still flying missions like this one, because there is, quite simply, nothing yet built to replace it. But strip away the geopolitics for a moment, because the real reason this mission deserves your attention has almost nothing to do with rockets or diplomacy, and everything to do with what happens inside the human body when it is removed from the only gravitational environment it ever evolved to survive in. Every astronaut who leaves Earth is, in a very real sense, volunteering to become a living experiment. Without gravity pulling blood downward into the legs, fluid shifts upward into the chest and skull, causing many astronauts' faces to swell within days of arriving in orbit, a phenomenon flight. Surgeons only half-jokingly call puffy face syndrome, and one that researchers now suspect is connected to concerning changes in eye pressure and vision that some long-duration astronauts experience, changes that, in some cases, have never fully reversed even after their return to Earth. Bones, no longer bearing weight, begin losing density at a rate that would take a decade to match through age-related osteoporosis on the ground, a process astronauts fight daily with hours of resistance exercise on custom equipment bolted to the station's walls. Muscles atrophy. The immune system quietly falters in ways scientists still do not fully understand. Radiation, unfiltered by the thick blanket of atmosphere that protects everyone reading this right now, bombards the body continuously, a slow-motion exposure whose long-term cancer risk remains one of the most actively studied open questions in all of spaceflight medicine. This is precisely the terrain Anil Menon has spent his entire career mapping, first as the physician monitoring other astronauts from the ground, and now, finally, as the subject himself, generating data about his own body that flight surgeons just like the one he used to be will study for years to come. And this is where his research assignment aboard the station becomes genuinely fascinating, because among the experiments Menon will be running during his 8 months in orbit is work on manufacturing semiconductor crystals in microgravity, a field that sounds almost mundane until you understand what is actually happening at the atomic scale. On Earth, when crystals grow, whether in a laboratory furnace or a factory, gravity constantly interferes with the process. Denser materials sink, lighter materials rise. Convection currents swirl through the liquid or vapor as the crystal forms, introducing microscopic defects, tiny imperfections in the crystal lattice that limit how efficient the finished material can be at conducting or manipulating electricity. In the near weightlessness of orbit, those convection currents essentially disappear. Crystals can grow in near-perfect, undisturbed silence, forming structures with dramatically fewer defects than anything achievable under Earth's gravity. Researchers have spent decades chasing this possibility, growing everything from protein crystals for pharmaceutical research to advanced semiconductor materials aboard the station, hoping to unlock manufacturing techniques that could eventually filter down into faster computer chips, more efficient solar cells, and next-generation fiber optic components. Materials so precise they simply cannot be replicated under the relentless pull of gravity. It sounds almost mystical, growing near-perfect crystals in the silence of orbit, but the physics behind it is coldly, beautifully simple. Remove gravity, remove the turbulence gravity creates, and the atoms are finally free to arrange themselves exactly the way their chemistry wants them to. None of this happens by accident, and none of it happens without extraordinary risk tolerance from everyone involved, which is worth sitting with for a moment before this story reaches its conclusion. Menon's own biography as a flight surgeon includes supporting missions that ended not in triumph, but in crisis. Missions where the difference between a safe return and a catastrophe came down to a coolant leak too small to see with the naked eye, a hairline puncture from a piece of debris smaller than a pebble. He has spent his career on the ground floor of exactly the kind of emergency that could, in theory, await him on this very flight. And he is flying anyway, on the same aging spacecraft. Architecture, launching from the same storied pad, trusting a system that has both quietly saved lives and quietly nearly lost them, because the alternative, retreating from human space, flight altogether out of fear of what might go wrong, has never once been how this species has explored anything. Every major leap into the unknown, from the earliest ocean voyages to the first flights across the Atlantic to the first steps onto another world, has demanded that someone accept odds they could not fully calculate and trust that the people who built the machine beneath them had done everything humanly possible to bring them home. So on the morning of July 14th, 2026, Anil Menon will finally close the hatch on a spacecraft for the first time, not as the physician certifying someone else's readiness to fly, but as the one whose readiness is finally, after 12 years, being tested for real. Somewhere in Houston, his colleagues, physicians he trained alongside, physicians he trained, will be watching his vital signs the way he once watched everyone else's. Somewhere, his wife, who has already made this exact journey and come home to tell him about it, will be watching too, understanding better than almost anyone alive what her husband is about to feel in the seconds after. The engines ignite, and 250 miles above the Kazakh steppe, a station that has never once gone dark in 25 years of continuous human occupation, will be waiting to welcome its newest resident, a man who has spent his entire career making sure other people came home safely, finally trusting that same system with his own life, so that the rest of us, watching from the ground, can keep learning what it actually takes for a human being to survive somewhere the human body was never built to go. Stay curious.